So I'm not here. Okay, so we need to practice shifting aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Past couple days, we've been talking about aggregate demand. Yesterday, we talked about aggregate supply, and we have those three sections that you see here. There we go, down there. And remember, it's going to be on the same graph. So we're talking about price level, real GDP, price level on the Y, GDP on the X, aggregate demand sloped downwards, labeled AD, or AD1, if you know that it's going to be shifting. Aggregate supply is sloped upwards with those three little sections. You can round off the corners, or you could leave it with those three sections. Whatever you want, that's your choice. And then we're going to label it AS1 for aggregate supply curve 1. Remember, where they intersect is equilibrium right there at the corner. And so you're going to draw your boops, boop, 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 all the way to the price level axis and all the way down again to the GDP axis. So shifting aggregate demand to the right looks like this. Shifting it to the left goes the opposite direction. You always just, unless I say otherwise, you're going to start here in the mid-run section in that upward sloping section. You're not going to necessarily start down here on the horizontal part. You're not going to necessarily start up here in the vertical part unless I say start in short run, start in long run, whatever. You're going to start in the mid-run unless I say otherwise. So like ceteris paribus, mid-run. But how does aggregate supply curve look when it shifts? Okay, so best way to do this is to draw the arrow first and then draw a new curve. And once again, it actually does. It's easier to shift if you are rounding out your edges. If you round out your edges, it is a little easier to shift. So a rightward shift of aggregate supply would look like this. So I'm going to actually, curve out my edges like right now. So it would be like, oh God, I'm doing this on the, there we go. That is a rightward shift. It shouldn't be shift like sloped upwards like that, but it's kind of hard to do this on the slate thing. So that is aggregate supply curve 2. That would be an increase. This is what an increase looks like. Aggregate supply, like a decrease to aggregate supply curve 3 would look like this. Be a leftward shift. That's a left arrow. And it would look something like that. Aggregate supply curve 3. That would be a decrease of supply. So remember, we had different aggregate demand curve shifters, and they're listed right there, down there on the screen. Aggregate demand curve, consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Well, our aggregate supply curve shifters are going to be basically the same thing as regular supply. Remember, we had night P, number of sellers, and pause this at any time to write this list down in your notes. Write down the shifters of aggregate demand again. Write down the shifters of aggregate supply. Have this picture that I have right here. Draw this so you know what it looks like to have an increasing and decreasing shift of aggregate supply. But remember, the shifters of aggregate supply are night P with a little bit extra thing at the end. Number of sellers, input prices, technology, expectations of like changes, including inflation. Productivity, and then just overall changes in FOPs. So like land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. If those things were to change, that's a change of resources. You can supply more or less if resources change. So let's do a couple examples together, and then I'm going to have you get this worksheet out. This worksheet is on the front table, so go grab one now. You can pause the video so you don't miss a thing and then come back. And we'll do a couple of these together, and there's a back to do it. So let me just erase this. I'm going to pause this really quick so I don't waste any time. Okay, so now we have a brand new graph, and I'm going to make something up that shifts aggregate supply and see what happens to like price level and GDP. Because remember, you have to do like your new equilibriums and show with arrows what happens to price and what happens to GDP. So if, let's say, let me do just a simple one, number of sellers. Let's just say that there are less sellers. How that might look like in a question is like, oh, multiple businesses declare bankruptcy, or a lot of businesses shut down, or something like that. So that would be less sellers. There's less sellers, and if there's less businesses, there's going to be less supply of things being sold, and less things anything made too. So that would be a leftward shift. So aggregate supply would shift to the left, something like that. And we have a new equilibrium right here. Pause if I'm going too fast. Boop, 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 boop. And then we have, here's our first equilibrium, here's our second. Boop, 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 boop. Here's our first equilibrium, and then here's our second. So it looks like price level went up and real GDP fell. There's actually a name for that. When aggregate supply shifts to the left, which raises prices, like there is inflation, and then the economy's worse off, like GDP just fell in that problem, but prices went up. That is called stagflation. That is, you might actually remember this from U.S. history. We had stagflation in the 70s. That's when you have higher prices and lower, like you lost your job and things are more expensive. That's pretty awful. That is called stagflation. There is no term for when aggregate supply increases and shifts to the right, but there is a term for when aggregate supply decreases and shifts to the left, and that's right there is stagflation. When you have higher prices, you have inflation and a lower GDP. Let's do another example. Okay, let's say our new example is the price of, let's say, oil decreases. The price of oil decreases. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Oil is a resource for basically everything that is produced, even t-shirts. Oil is in the machines that run, I'm sure, like the big t-shirt like making machines. Plus, how do you think that t-shirt got to the store where you bought it? On a car, which requires oil, like on a big truck. So oil is in the production of everything, and oil is a huge input. And so this would be an example of an input price. And if input prices go down and inputs are cheaper and resources are cheaper, then I can make more. It's like if chocolate chips were cheaper, could you make more or less chocolate chip cookies? Well, more, because the resources are cheaper. And so aggregate supply in this example would shift to the right. So you'd draw like a right arrow, and then you shift aggregate supply. Did I say demand before? I don't know. Aggregate supply to the right. There's more supply because resources are cheaper. Of course, this is the best type of shift possible. There's no name for this shift, a rightward shift, but it is the best. Because look, prices fell, price level went down, prices are cheaper, and our economy's better. Like GDP is going up and things are cheaper. That's great. You have a job and things are cheaper. That's great. That is like a win-win. So that would be an example of lower input prices increasing the aggregate supply in the economy, which in turn lowers prices and raises GDP. Okay, so pause the video right now. Go grab one of these from the front if you haven't already, and let's look at some of the problems on here. Okay, so if you look at the directions, you are going to start curve C for the first question, and then if it increases, if the situation increases aggregate supply, you're going to shift it one at a time. You're going to go to curve D, or if it shifts to the left, you're going to go to curve B. And then the next question starts wherever you left off. So if you're at, let's say, letter C, curve E, there's nowhere to go but to the left. So if your next problem has you shifting to the right, well, you messed up somewhere because there's nothing further right than E, and there's nothing further left than A. So there's nowhere you can go. So it kind of narrows down. There's 9 scenarios, and you have to think, is it going to be shifting, how is it going to shift aggregate supply? This is not testing your aggregate demand versus aggregate supply. This is just going to be shifting aggregate supply, except for one of them. One of them will be a no change because it is an aggregate demand shifter, and aggregate demand is not an option here. So there is one of these 9 scenarios that is going to shift aggregate demand. So I'm going to give you some time to do it. I want you to pause the video, and then we will go over it. If you are straight watching this, you might think you got it when you don't. So try to pause, and then if you get stuck, maybe watch the video, but try to do as much of this as you can, all 9, and keep in mind that there is one that is a no shifter because it is an aggregate demand shifter, not aggregate supply. So pause it now. Okay, so let's go over. Hopefully you paused it and did your work, and hopefully we'll see. So on number 1, it says unions grow more aggressive, wage rates increase. So wage rate is like what you have to pay your employees. It's not like how much you make. That would be income. So if you see the word income, that's like focusing on demand. But if you see the word wage, that's going to be an aggregate supply thing. So wage rates is what you have to pay your employees. If you have to pay them more because wages are going up, you can't supply as much. So it's like your pepperonis are now more expensive. Can you make more or less pizzas? Well, I can't buy as many pepperonis. I can't make as much pizzas. So on number 1, aggregate supply is going to decrease, and you're going to go from curve C to curve B. And the next question starts off at curve B. Number 2, OPEC successfully increases oil prices. Well, we just did an oil example. And so if OPEC increases oil prices, you can't make as much because oil is a resource, it's an input. And if oil is more expensive, you can't produce as much. So aggregate supply is going to shift even further left to curve A. On number 3, labor productivity increases. Well, it looks like productivity is a shifter of aggregate supply. And if we are, so like right now, hold on, we went left again. So on 1 and then 2. And then on number 3, productivity increases. People are being more productive. They're making more things. Well, you probably are supplying more things if you're making more things. And so on number 3, we're shifting back to the right to curve B. Number 4, giant natural gas discovery decreases energy prices. So energy is cheaper. It's kind of like the oil problem. If oil is cheaper, if energy is cheaper, you can supply more because your inputs, like a resource of energy, is cheaper, so you can supply more. And shift to C. It's a rightward shift because you're making more. On number 5, computer technology brings new efficiency to the industry. Technology is a shifter of aggregate supply, and so if you're increasing your technology brings new efficiency, you can produce more. And so aggregate supply is going to shift to the right from C to letter D. So number 5 is a rightward shift. Number 6, government spending increases. Government spending is a shifter of aggregate demand. That one's going to be our no change. It's not going to affect aggregate supply if government spending changes. It's going to affect aggregate demand, but that's not what the question is asking. It's asking about what happens to aggregate supply, which is nothing. So you're going to still be at curve D because that's where we were when we left off. On number 7, tax cuts rates increase incentives to work, save, and invest. And so it says their incentive to work, then incentive to work and to produce more because lower taxes. Yes, we talk about lower taxes increase in consumption, but it does say it increases the incentives to work. I will give you money if you work more. Well, I'm probably going to work more, which means I'm probably going to supply more if I'm working more, and aggregate supply is going to shift further to the right on question number 7. Because remember 6 was a no change, so we're going from 6 to 7. 7, it's going to shift to the right to curve E. On number 8, the low birth rate will decrease the labor force, so there's going to be less sellers if there's less people being born. Like maybe not right now, but in the future. And if there's less people, there's less supply. So on number 8, aggregate supply is shifting to the left from curve E to curve D. And on number 9, research shows that improved schools have, Research shows that improved schools have increased the skills of American workers and managers, so we are more skilled. So it's not necessarily like number of sellers, but we are being more productive if we have more skills. So we are going to shift back outwards on number 9. And if I remember correctly, it goes from C to B to A to B to C to D to E, back to D, back to E. So you should have ended on E. That was kind of confusing. I had to do that in my head. I didn't write anything down. So there's that. On the back, I do want you to read those 4 bullet points at the top for you to understand what's happening in these boxes. You do have to ask yourself, is it going to be aggregate demand or aggregate supply? So look at your shifters. Aggregate demand shifters are CIGXN. Aggregate supply shifters are NIGHT-P. Figure out, is it shifting supply or demand? And then draw that on our graph at the bottom. Ignore that LRAS graph. I kind of drew on that on the original and I forgot. So ignore that.